Hey, welcome back to our skills videos. I'm really excited about this one today. This is the single most requested skill in any clinic or one-on-one session that we have. Everybody wants to know how to jump and how to hop their bike. That's the same exact movement, just with different timing, and it's also the same thing when we're trying to pump terrain features. I'm going to show you today how it's just a couple simple body movements. It's a hip hinge and a row and an anti-row. And when we put those together with the right timing, we can do almost anything on the bike. And what's great about that is you don't have to worry about, well, in this situation I do X, but in that situation I do Y. It's the same movements, just with different timing. And the only thing we're varying is the degree to which we're changing the angle of the bike. We're going to go over to the pump track, and I'm going to show you how that all works. We're over here at the pump track, which we're very lucky to have here in town. And this is actually where we start an awful lot of our skills training, especially the one-on-one stuff. The reason being, these type of shapes teach us to be in balance on our bike. And if we can be in balance as we're riding through the trail, a lot of the stuff that people concern themselves with, the roots, the rocks along the way, that stuff's actually sort of just noise, and it's much easier to deal with. If we're not in balance, all of those things are going to throw us around even more. We don't want the terrain to push us around. We want to preemptively move our bike. So we want to be able to tip the bike back as we're going up and over something, and we want to preemptively tip the bike down as we're going down the backside of something. Let's put our bikes down, because oftentimes that gets in the way when we start to think about these motions. Remember, we talked about, we got our base of support, our triangle of awesome. And so we want to think about getting into a hip hinge position. So this would be basically our high hip hinge. We can go from there into a low hip hinge. So a low hip hinge with our arms pushed out, this is if we're going down something steep. And I'll show you that in motion in a minute. Then we want to row the bars towards us and stand up. So this is a row, and this is an anti-row. So we're going to row the bars up towards us, and notice I'm not pulling up, I'm not pulling them towards my chest, and I'm not trying to lift the bike. Usually when people get onto rolling terrain, they think a lot about their arms, and they want to just drive the bike up and down. What we want to do is tip the bike back and forth, tip the bike. That happens by going from a deep hip hinge with an anti-row into standing up tall with a row, and then back out into an anti-row, back out into a nice hip hinge. Okay, so now I'm going to show you that in motion. So we're going to go over a relatively large roller, but I'm going to do it slow and exaggerate the motions out so you can see how we go from a hip hinge into a row standing up tall, and then we transition back to a hip hinge and anti-row as we go down the far side. So I'm hip hinged, row, anti-row, hip hinge. Now we're going to take that into smooth motion over a smaller roller, and we'll transition that to bigger ones as well. But I want you to see that in motion, and we'll do it a bunch of times, and we'll also show it in slow motion so you see how it works. So as we roll in, drop into a hip hinge, row, anti-row, row, anti-row, row, anti-row. One of the things that being on a pump track teaches us is timing. And that's a skill that we take off to the trails as well. But I want to look at how we reinforce timing here, because if you look at these bumps, so now in between these rollers, I've got almost a bike length of flat between the transitions of the downslope of that one and the upslope of that one. Now if I step forward to here, I've got less than half a bike length. See, I'm still coming off of this one while I roll up this one. What we need to learn to do is to modify our movements basically to be a little more subtle we need to also think about how steep is the feature that I'm going over. When we were on the rollers over there, the big ones, those are much steeper. Those are more like 30 plus degrees on the bigger ones. These, I mean, these are 20 degrees, 15 degrees. So we don't need to do quite as big of a row or anti-row to navigate them. What we really need to do though, is we need to stay in our hip hinge and we need to make sure that the arms are doing the row position, right? The row movement. I'm gonna show you how that works, and we're just gonna ride a bunch of features on here, and you'll see how I'm staying what will look like somewhat neutral, but what always happens when people get on a pump track is they start to collapse forward because they start getting into this like up and down motion with their arms. Watch my arms, they're gonna track front to back, and that's the exact same motion that we wanna take out onto the trails. So that's why these are so good for us, these pump tracks. They build that muscle memory of that movement, and we take that out onto single track with us. Now I want to talk about the last piece of the puzzle here, which is being able to choose how and when we get heavy on the bike. I like to think of this as a stomp. If we were to picture standing on a bathroom scale and without our feet leaving the ground, we want to make that needle jump, and we want to make it jump as much as possible. But remember, I said you can't jump off the ground. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to surge your weight down through your feet. You're going to stomp down through your feet. That's exactly what we want to do when we're on the back side of a feature. If we're on a downslope, like on the other side of this roller, we're going to stomp down through our feet. And that timing needs to be really critical because it's not the same time that we're going over the top. Oftentimes people get confused because they think, okay, now I'm going over the top, so right about here is where I should stomp. But if you look at it, my bike is, I'm going to stomp down into flat ground still. I'm not going to create the motion that I want. It's a matter of waiting a little bit, waiting half a tick until you get onto this downslope completely, and then boom, surge your weight down through your heels. Okay? I'm going to show you how that works, and I'm going to point out the moments that we want to apply that. Okay, and now the moment you've all been waiting for. How do we turn that pump into a jump? All we have to do is slow down our timing. It's the exact same motions. That means just putting a little pause in between our row, which allows the bike to keep going upwards, and our anti-row, which then arcs the bike to match the landing. I'll show you what that looks like in motion. You see how it's the exact same motions, just with the timing being different. The way I like to think of it, I used to think years ago that you had to really yank up when you were jumping. You really had to put a lot into the bike. But then if you watch the best dirt jumpers, they look lazy when they're riding. And that's really what it comes down to. Slowing down your timing, pull the bike up into the arc with your row, and then wait that half a tick, wait, and then arc the bike down. And that's all there is to jumping. And it's not a yank up on the bike. It's not a jerk up on the bars. And it's also not, notice I never preloaded my suspension. Everyone talks about needing to squash the bike into the jump, needing to preload things, but then you watch dirt jumpers and they're riding bikes with very little or no suspension. So you don't need to preload your bike. You need to maybe get heavy, but that's not the same thing.
Let's watch this one more time to see that in action. So as we roll in, we get heavy with a stomp down through our feet, and then we proceed into our row, waiting half a tick, and then our anti-row and hip hinge to match the angle of the landing.
Now we're going to talk about the hop. I think of this as something that follows jumping, because jumping is actually just slowing the timing down, which is a little bit easier to do. What we need to do now is advance the timing. We need to preemptively tip the bike back before we ever get to an obstacle, and then arc the bike to match or exceed the height of the obstacle. In this case, we're going to use this roller, and you see I'm going to roll in, and I'm going to do my hop before I really get to the upslope of it so that I can land on the top and ride the back slope of it. And that's a really powerful skill to have out on the trails, because there's all kinds of features on the trail where you have a downslope, be it this size or even a little bit smaller. And if we can get our bike off the ground a little bit, get really light, and then match the terrain and come down nice and heavy, well, we can get an awful lot of speed out of that. Now you see that timing was different, but it was different in that it was early. I needed to do my row very early, and I needed to do my anti-row as my front tire got to the height that I wanted to arc the rest of the bike. Let's see that again.
Let's watch this first at regular speed as we hop over this roller. Now let's see it again in slow motion. So look at our starting position right here with a big hip hinge, nice and low. Now we do an aggressive row, and then right here as our front wheel peaks, we go into a very aggressive anti-row to arc the bike and match the landing.
One thing that you may or may not see in these clips is I'm not pulling up with my feet. In fact, pulling up with our feet actually short circuits the motions that we're trying to do. And I see this all the time when we're working with athletes. They go to get into their hop and they get a perfect front wheel lift with a nice row and they're up high, and then they jerk up on the pedals without doing an anti-row and a hip hinge, and the whole thing falls apart and their front end of the bike just comes right back down. Whether we ride clipless or flats, it does not matter. What matters is, are we achieving these motions? And if you do that, you don't need to pull up with your pedals, and in fact, it's better if you don't. So I highly recommend practicing on something like a roller or a smaller feature first, something that is very non-threatening, both because it's going to be safer, but also because you're going to find an easier time to execute it. But I want to show that that motion is the exact same thing we would do hopping up onto a square-edged ledge. Be the same thing if there was no landing on this side and it was just a log that we were hopping over. It's the exact same motion.
Let's watch this again in slow motion and take note of 3 important body positions. The first is right here where I drop back into a hip hinge and get heavy. Now I go into an aggressive row and end with my hips all the way forward and the handlebars pulled back to my legs. The height that we achieve in this position determines how high we're going to get off the ground. Now we simultaneously push the bars away from us in an anti-row and drop back into a hip hinge. This allows the bike to arc up and over the obstacle and allows us a smooth landing. I hope this video has helped teach the fundamentals of pumping, jumping, and hopping. These are truly crucial skills for us to progress as mountain bikers. We're going to have an additional video linked here which focuses solely on hopping and gives some drills for how to break down the movements and make it easier to learn.